about an Irish-American boxer, John L. Sullivan. All my writing has been in the history realm. And when I was looking for the subject of another book, I found this great idea, and I told my agent about it. I said, I got a story. It's about a band of Irish Americans who flee the Great Hunger, immigrate to America, fight on both sides of the Civil War, and then undertake one of the most fantastical missions in military history to hold Canada hostage and ransom it for Ireland's independence. And her question is, well, I didn't know you wanted to write fiction, but I had to assure her, no, this is an absolute true story. I know it sounds like Blarney, but it's absolutely true. So part of what I want to do tonight is take you back more than 150 years to see that the story is not as absurd as it sounds like to us today. So why would anyone want to attack sweet, peaceable, friendly Canada, a place where even if you get into an accident with the local bus, it will tell you sorry? Well, part of it is we're viewing the lens of we're reviewing history through the lens of today, where Canada and the United States share the longest peaceable border in the world. But things between the United States and Canada were not always so polite. And in the first American century, the United States had a border problem, but it was a northern one. And the border between the United States and Canada was this lawless no man's land that was frequented by outlaws and smugglers. And the idea of invading Canada was about as American as fireworks on the 4th of July in the first 100 years of American history. So even before the Declaration of Independence is signed in 1776, one of the first places the Continental Army goes is due north to Canada. So you have a regiment led by General Richard Montgomery that goes up through the Lake Champlain Valley. Another one is led by Benedict Arnold that goes up through Maine. Montgomery captures Montreal, meets up with Arnold on the outskirts of Quebec City on New Year's Eve in 1775 in a battle that turns out to be a decisive defeat for the Continental Army. During the War of 1812, again, Canada was a primary target. Thomas Jefferson wrote that the taking of Canada was going to be a mere matter of marching. Turns out it wasn't. Three-pronged invasion was planned, and it failed. And even before the British burned down the White House and set fire to much Washington, D.C., they were doing that in revenge because the Americans had set fire to what is present-day Toronto. It was known as York back then, and a provincial capital. And then you start getting these these sort of farcical interactions with equally farcical names along the border. So there's the Pork and Beans War of 1838 between lumberjacks in New Brunswick and Maine who are battling over the same timber rights. My favorite one's the Pig War of 1859. This started on a disputed island in what are known as the San Juan Islands in the Pacific Northwest, where an American saw a pig that was rooting around in his garden, shot it dead. Turned out the pig was property of Canada's Hudson's Bay Company. Let's just say that things got a little out of control to the point that the British send 5 warships and 4,000 men. The Americans send 2,000 men to this island, and they engage basically in a standoff for months on end. No shots were fired. It said the biggest combat threat to the soldiers who were sent to San Juan Island was just the sheer boredom of staring at each other. So the other thing to remember about this time period is that the flag that's flying over Canada is not the maple leaf that we're all familiar with today. It's the Union Jack. Canada is a British province at the time, same with Ireland. And if you were using today's parlance, you would say that the Irish living under British rule in Ireland were radicalized by their experience. The luck of the Irish was not something you really wanted to have for about 700 years of Irish history, because they had the poor fortune of being in the backyard of Great Britain. And of course, the British Empire would go on to be the most powerful empire in the world. And really, Ireland is its first colony. And if you were an Irish Catholic, your rights were very restricted living under British rule, particularly in the 1700s under what were called the penal laws. So if you were an Irish Catholic living in Ireland, you were not allowed to freely worship, vote, you couldn't hold public office, you couldn't send your children to a Catholic school teacher, you couldn't have a Catholic teacher come in to instruct your children, you cannot own firearms, you could own a horse as long as its value was under £5. You were allowed to have one knife as long as it was chained to a table so that you could not use it against the local police. And even in death, your rights were still restricted because you were not allowed to have a Catholic priest preside over any graveside ceremonies in Ireland. So for 700 years, the many Irish believed that the British were trying to extinguish their religion, their culture, and their language. And then when the potato crop fails in 1845, there's a segment of the Irish population who think that the British are trying to exterminate them altogether. During what is known as a Great Hunger, that lasts for about 7 years, there are 1 million Irish who are going to die. There are 2 million who are forced to flee the island. And you have Ireland that had a population of 8 million in 1845. By the end of the Great Hunger, it's down to less than 5 million. Still has not gone back to the levels that it was at pre the failure of the potato crop. So you have just 2 million people leaving Ireland. About half of them are going to travel across the Atlantic to go to Canada and the United States. And the Irish who come to America are unlike any newcomers that the country had ever seen before. For starters, they're really refugees. They're not immigrants. They're not hungering for American ideals as much as they are literally starving for food. They speak a foreign tongue. About a quarter of them speak the Irish language, do not speak any English. And what really sets them apart is that the majority of these Irish are practicing to what many Americans at the time is an alien religion, Catholicism. So they're coming to a country that was, founded on Protestant ideals by the founding fathers, going back to the Pilgrims, the Puritans, who were seeking America to be this haven away from any papal influence they may see in the Protestant religion. So it's not surprising when you have hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics flooding into the country that a backlash ensues and really gains its strength in the early 1850s with the rise of what's known as the Know Nothing movement, and really reaches its crescendo, this birth of political nativism, in 1854. A year that sees churches, Catholic churches being burned, priests who are tarred and feathered. Even during the middle of the night while the Washington Monument is being constructed, there are a band of know-nothings who break into the construction site, tie up the night watchman. They go searching around the grounds of the construction site, find this block of marble that they've been looking for. They put it into a wheelbarrow, wheel it down to the Potomac River, take it out on a boat, throw it into the river where it sinks to the bottom. And the whole reason they're doing it is because this particular block of marble was donated by the Pope. And they think that this block of marble would be a signal to Catholics in America to rise up, stage a revolution, and erect a second Vatican, and wait for it, Cincinnati. So they achieved political power, though, in the ballot box in 1854 as well. They capture about 8 or 9 different governorships, and they get their most power right here in Massachusetts, where they win all but 3 seats in the state legislature. They sweep all the political offices statewide. And then they start to implement their political agenda, which included mandating the use of the Protestant Bible in public schools. They launched surprise inspections of nunneries and rectories. They shut down Irish American militias, and they actually start deporting some of the Irish back to the British Isles. So to say that the Irish didn't assimilate easily into American life would be a vast understatement. England had long talked about the Irish problem. And of course, to the English, the problem with the Irish were they weren't English. And the way that Ireland was able to survive 700 years of colonization was they turned inward. They banded together in church parishes, and when they came to America, in organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians. So, they were clinging together in their homeland. That's how they were able to keep their culture, their religion, their language alive. So when they come to the United States, they face the same sort of prejudice. They react in much the same way. So in addition to clinging together in the church parishes and the AOH, in 1858, they start to join a new organization called the Fenian Brotherhood. And this is an organization that comes about mainly to the work by the doings of these two men here. On the left is James Stephens, on the right is John O'Mahony. And these two men were Irish revolutionaries. They were leaders in a movement called Young Ireland that attempted a revolution in Ireland in 1848 against the British that failed pretty quickly. Now, James Stephens on the left has a very interesting story about what happens during this revolution. And he sort of rips a page right out of a Mark Twain novel and fakes his own death. So James Stephens is in a shootout with the local police. He's shot. The police assume that he's dead along the side of the road, but Stephens had managed to survive this shootout. And then he is on the run, basically in the mountains of Ireland, at the same time that the Young Ireland supporters are using this the idea that he's dead to their advantage. So they run his obituary in a local Kilkenny, Ireland newspaper. The coffin is buried in his local cemetery, filled with rocks. But the whole time, James Stephens is on the lam through the mountains of Ireland, manages to pass over to England, travels through England, said he actually spends a night right across the street from Buckingham Palace in a hotel before he flees to safety in Paris. And he'll meet up there with John O'Mahony as well. And both men live in Paris for several years, but once the Great Hunger has finished, they both think that it's time again to launch another revolution in Ireland. So on St. Patrick's Day in 1858, James Stephens starts a new society called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And later that year, John O'Mahony, who has immigrated to the United States, will found a sister organization called the Fenian Brotherhood. And the idea is that in Ireland, James Stephens is going to supply the manpower for the next revolution. And with the freedoms that the United States provides, John O'Mahony is going to raise money and purchase weapons that he's going to ship back to Ireland to arm James Stephens' new army. So the members of this society, when it started out, it was a secret oath-based society. It had to take this secret pledge. And because of that, the Fenian Brotherhood runs afoul of the Catholic Church right from the start, because the Catholic Church does not allow any of its members to take oaths to secret societies. So even after several years, when the Fenian Brotherhood stops becoming a secret society and operates completely out in the open, it still has an enemy in the Catholic Church, to the point that in 1871, the Pope actually issues an edict that any members of the Fenian Brotherhood are going to be excommunicated. The real irony of this situation is that the one thing, as we'll see, that the Fenians are terrible at doing, it's keeping a secret. So the plan is in place to have this revolution in Ireland. The work is being undertaken, money is being raised, and then all of a sudden, war breaks out in America with the Civil War, and all plans are put on hold. And one of the amazing things I found doing the research for this book, there's a scholar named Damien Shields who has done a lot of research into the participation of native-born Irish in the American Civil War. And according to his research, nearly 200,000 men who were born in Ireland fight in the Civil War. Most of them on the Union side, about 20,000 on the Confederate side. Where they fought, on which side, was pretty much dictated just by a matter of geography, where they had happened to settle after coming to America. Um, but at the start of the war, you have, by the tens of thousands, the Irish are enlisting, not necessarily in the cause on the Union side of the cause of freeing slaves, who they would see as competition, their economic competitors for low-wage jobs. The Irish are joining just because they need a wage. Many of them are still unemployed. They see they don't believe the war is going to last too long, so they will enlist for 90 days, get their pay, and then use that money just to earn a living. But there is a segment of the Fenians who then decide that this is a good idea. Let's enlist in the war. We'll get experience with battlefield tactics, with weaponry, and we'll be able to use that for the real war that we want to fight, and that's going to be the revolution against Great Britain. As the war, of course, drags on, lasts more than 3 months, lasts more than a year, lasts longer than any of those who enlisted really thought it would. And the Irish are the ones who are going to pay a pretty heavy price in terms of battlefield casualties. But as the war goes on, these Union camps become recruiting grounds for the Fenians. They'll send recruiters to go from camp to camp where they will enlist men into the Fenian Brotherhood. And by 1863, they're gaining strength, and the Union Army actually allows Fenian members to leave the front lines to go to a national convention in Chicago. That's just a symbol of how they're starting to grow in numbers. But their membership really takes off at the end of the Civil War, when they send recruiters up to the mill cities of New England, to the mining towns of Appalachia, so that by early 1866, there's tens of thousands of members in the Fenian Brotherhood, and they're operating completely out in the open. They have their own president, their own constitution. They've established their own Irish Republic, state in exile in the United States, and they even have their own Capitol building, which is on the screen here. Is the Moffett Mansion, which was a brownstone on the north side of Union Square in New York City. You can see that from the top of it are flying both the Stars and Stripes and an Irish Republican flag. So again, they're operating completely out in the open, yet still an organization that is banned by the Catholic Church because it's supposedly this secret organization. And the way that the Irish Republic in exile is raising money is by selling war bonds. So they're selling these war bonds. They're using the money then to pay for their expenses, to purchase weapons, which were, of course, in abundant supply at the end of the Civil War. So they're selling these war bonds in denominations from $10 to $500, and they would be payable with interest 6 months after the establishment of the Irish Republic. Now, there's an interesting historical footnote to this, that when the Irish Republic is eventually established in the 1920s, all of a sudden, people in America are pulling these bonds out of their closets and their drawers in America looking to get paid up. The Irish Republic has no idea what these war bonds are from, and of course don't pay out. But these days, if you go on eBay, they'll pay back a pretty penny on their original investment. So plans all in place for this another revolution in Ireland in the fall of 1865. But the British catch wind of it. They infiltrate the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They launch a raid on all the IRB leaders. James Stephens is forced to go into exile. And basically this whole plan of having a revolution in Ireland is pretty much dead in the water for at least the foreseeable future. But this is happening at the same time that there's a split starting to form inside the Fenian Brotherhood, who think this whole idea of having another revolution in Ireland is a crazy idea. It's been tried several times in the recent decades, hadn't worked. They wonder, how are we going to be able to get all these arms and money over to Ireland when we don't even have a navy. Not only do we not have a navy, we don't even have a single boat. So how are we going to launch this revolution from thousands of miles in an ocean away? Why don't we go to the place of the British Empire where we can get on a train and we can be there in a few hours, and that is in Canada. So this group, they call themselves the Men of Action, want to take the Fenian Brotherhood and launch this invasion in Canada. So what are they hoping to do? Why attack Canada? Well, one idea is that if they attack Canada, maybe that will divert British troops from Ireland and make the chances of a revolution in Ireland more successful. Another idea is that they can gain a piece of ground from which they can launch privateers out onto the ocean. But really their best chance of success, the one that maybe makes the most sense, is that maybe they can spark a war between the United States and Great Britain. And by helping the United States gain Canada, in return, the United States would help grant Ireland its independence. But there really are a group of diehards who think that what they can really do is that the taking of Canada, like Thomas Jefferson had thought 50 years earlier, would be a mere matter of marching, that they could get into Canada, they'd easily be able to take it from the British, hold it hostage, and ransom it for Ireland's independence. And the thing that really surprised me probably the most in doing the research for this book is that this is an idea that actually has the tacit support of the United States government. So, of course, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Fenians are buying a lot of the surplus arms and ammunition at auction from the United States government. And then there's a meeting that is held at the White House in the fall of 1865 between leaders of the Fenian Brotherhood and President Andrew Johnson, in which they float the idea of invading Canada. And Johnson basically tells them that he will, quote, acknowledge accomplished facts, saying he won't give them any outright support, but he'll turn a blind eye to what they do. And if he wakes up one day and they're in Canada, well, then we'll deal with it at that point. So why would President Johnson have this stance when it's a violation of American law for any private citizens to attack a country with which the United States is at peace? Well, it just goes to speak to the tremendous animosity that existed toward the British by the Union over what happened during the Civil War. And that's because Great Britain basically was giving its tacit support to the Confederacy. It had declared neutrality during the Civil War. And in Great Britain were built Confederate guns, and Confederate warships were being built in the ports of, in British ports, such as Liverpool. Even some of these Confederate warships were being manned by British sailors as well. And these Confederate ships were privateers that were launching raids against Union shipping all across the world. And the most fearsome of these was this ship here called the CSS Alabama, that by the end of the war had just decimated a lot of Union shipping, took goods worth millions of dollars. And at the end of the war, the United States wants reparations for all these damages, millions of dollars in damages from Great Britain. And they launch a claim for what are called the Alabama claims, is what these are called. So the United States wants these reparations from Great Britain, and there's animosity towards Canada too for what happened during the Civil War, because it was a haven for draft dodgers and escaped Confederate POWs. And it was also a haven for a cell of the Confederate Secret Service that launched raids on bank in St. Albans, Vermont, which they stole tens of thousands of dollars. They tried a firebombing of theaters and hotels in New York City in November of 1864 that didn't go as planned. And there's a thought that this Confederate Secret Service cell in Canada was also behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. There were reports that John Wilkes Booth was seen on the streets of Montreal in the days before the assassination, and it was said that after he was killed, there was a note from the Royal Ontario Bank that was found in his possessions. So you have this animosity towards the British, this animosity towards Canadians, and at the same time, you have this idea of manifest destiny that's still at hold in the country. So the United States has gained territory in the Southwest from Mexico. It has now reunited the South. It stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So where's the next place for the United States to expand? Well, it's going to be north to Canada. So there's actually a bill that's introduced in Congress in 1865 that outlays where the 4 new states would come into from Canadian territory, where the 29 new Congress people would be apportioned. And it was assumed that Canadians, of course, wanted to be part of the United States. That was just the thinking in the country at the time. So there's also this that happens at the end of the Civil War. There's a plan that's introduced into the Congress by a Michigan senator named Zach Chandler that had the support of, I think, about a couple dozen other senators. And his plan was, as a way to reunite the country after the Civil War, was to put together a 200,000-man army with 100,000 soldiers from the north, 100,000 soldiers from the south, and they would invade Canada, and they would basically hold it hostage until Great Britain paid out the Alabama claims. So into Andrew Johnson's office in the fall of 1865 come the Irish with basically the same plan. So pretty much, thought, let's outsource the job to the immigrants, let them do it. So the plan is now taking fold to invade Canada, and it's the brainchild of this man, who is Thomas William Sweeney, who really is the epitome of the Fighting Irish. He comes to America when he's 8 years old, but he's washed overboard on the voyage, but managed to survive 30 minutes in the cold Atlantic before he's rescued. He enlists in the Union Army, fights in the Mexican-American War. He's in a battle during the Mexican-American War where he is shot in the groin, but he still keeps fighting until then he takes bullet shots that pierce his right arm that leads to its amputation. Sweeney will remain in the Army, however. He fights in the Union Army, gets into a fist fight with one of his superior officers and manages to whip him with his one good arm. He is said to be instrumental at the Battle of Shiloh, even though he takes another couple gunshots to the leg, another in his remaining arm. So even through all this, after the Civil War, he's literally given his right arm to the cause of the Union. He's been in the Union Army for nearly 2 decades, but he's still thinking about his homeland. So after the war, he takes the position as a Secretary of War for the Fenian Brotherhood, and he devises the plan for the invasion of Canada, and this is what it looked like. So it's a 5-pronged invasion. It's going to be an amphibious invasion from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo. He's going to have those forces from those 4 cities march on Toronto. And this is all a feint, however. What he hopes to do is to draw British forces away from Montreal and away from Quebec, which is really his true target. Because he plans to put together a 17,000-man army that's going to go right up through the Lake Champlain Valley, seize Montreal, seize Quebec City, and then put a chokehold on the St. Lawrence River, which is really the lifeblood of trade and commerce into Canada. And baked into his plan is that he expects that he's going to get the full support of the Irish who are living in Canada. There's hundreds of thousands of them. He expects to get the support of all the French Canadians who he expects want to cast off the British rule. And he also expects a lot of Canadians, even of English origin, really would prefer to be part of the United States. So he expects to get their support as well. So, so that's the plan that he puts together. And this man here, John O'Neill, to him, this sounds like a great plan. Never became part of the Fenian Brotherhood until he heard about the plan for invading Canada. And John O'Neill is really the central figure in when the Irish invaded Canada. He's going to be involved in some part of all 5 of these attacks on Canada, which are called the Fenian Raids. Now, John O'Neill, he's born in County Monaghan in near the north of Ireland, sort of on the border, present-day border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Sort of a no man's land. But John O'Neill learned of great ancestors, members of his clan, such as Hugh O'Neill, Owen Roe O'Neill, who were heroic figures to the Irish, not because they defeated the British in a revolution, but they rose up and rebelled against the British. They dared to fight. So John O'Neill learns from a very young age just that the matter of rebelling against the British can make you a true hero in Ireland. And then at the age of 10, he sees devastation caused by the failure of the potato crop, and he's forced to leave Ireland, comes to America. He'll fight in the Civil War. He will be wounded during the Peninsular Campaign. And then after the war, he settles in Nashville, where he has a very lucrative insurance claims business going. But then he gets this telegram from Thomas William Sweeney telling him to get to the front lines. The attack on Canada is on in the spring of 1866. And John O'Neill thinks nothing of then leaving home, leaving behind his wife, his 2-month-old son, his business that's worth $50,000, and invading Canada. He knew the odds were against him, but the odds were always against the Irish. That's just what history had taught him. And there was no glory that could be found in doing nothing at all, so he might as well do something. So he gets on a train north to Cleveland, and when he gets to Cleveland, he finds out what Sweeney is finding out, and that is the plan is starting to fall apart very rapidly, and that is because, again, the Irish were not too good, the Fenians were not too good at keeping secrets. All their movements were front page news across the country. They were infiltrated by British spies, by Canadian spies, by the Americans. Everyone knew what the Fenians were doing, so there really wasn't much of an element of surprise. The boats that Sweeney had tried to get in Chicago weren't there. His commanders weren't there in Cleveland. So Sweeney's just changing the plan on the fly. He just orders all his men, as many as they can collect, get to Buffalo, let's get across the Niagara River. When we do, then we'll get tens of thousands of Irish from America coming behind them. We'll be able to get all the Canadians, Irish Canadians, to help us out. So Sweeney just wants to get the invasion started. So John O'Neill really is the right man in the right place at the right time, because when he arrives in Buffalo, there's about 800 Fenians. He's the highest ranking man that they can find. And so he's the one who's put in charge of launching this invasion of Canada. And O'Neill had basically been born and bred for this role. I mean, he saw himself as an heir to these great O'Neill clansmen. And he wrote that the governing passion of my life, apart from my duty to my God, is to be at the head of an Irish army battling against England for Ireland's rights. For this I live, and for this, if necessary, I'm willing to die. So on the night of May 31st, 1866, hundreds of Irish start collecting in the streets of Buffalo and starts marching north to the launch point for the invasion. It's a very mishmash group. There's old and young. A lot of them are Civil War veterans, many of them from the Union side, but some of them came as far as from New Orleans. They fought on the Confederate side. Some of them are wearing their Union blues, others are wearing their Confederate grays. Many of them are still just wearing civilian clothes. A lot of them are carrying the rifles that they carried in the Civil War that they had purchased at the end of the war. So strange enough, with all this buildup, though, the Canadians have no one on the other side of the river to defend their territory. There have been rumors of these Fenian invasions going on for months. They had called out all the home guard on St. Patrick's Day, thinking that was surely the day that the invasion was going to come, and it didn't happen. So the Canadians government sort of like the boy afraid to cry wolf. Their attitude is, all right, if an invasion actually happens, then we'll then we'll react to it. So John O'Neill knows, and the Fenians know, there's only one thing that's standing between them and Canadian territory, and that is an American warship that is in the port of Buffalo, the USS Michigan. So as I said, Johnson's not going to do anything to actively help the Fenians, but he's not going to do anything to actively harm them anyway. We're just going to let normal operations go on. So Normal operations for the USS Michigan is just to patrol the river in case anything is going on. So when news gets to the captain of the USS Michigan, Andrew Bryson, that there's hundreds of Irishmen marching through the streets of Buffalo, intent on attacking Canada, well, he wants to launch his warship out into the Niagara River. But what Andrew Bryson, the captain of the ship, does not know is that there's a secret Fenian cell on his ship. 17 members are Fenian members. And they know that this ship cannot go anywhere without its pilot, whose name is Patrick Murphy. But do not let the name fool you. Patrick Murphy is a loyal sailor. He was a member of the British Navy. He's been with the American Navy for many years. They know that Patrick Murphy will follow whatever orders that he's given. So they know, the Fenians know, that the only way that you're going to be able to get across this river is that they have to take Patrick Murphy out. And by that I mean they are going to take Patrick Murphy out for a night on the town in Buffalo, so that when Captain Andrew Bryson is looking for his pilot, Patrick Murphy is in the bars of Buffalo and is said to be staggering down Main Street singing the Wearing of the Green. So Bryson cannot get his ship into the water. The Fenians are able to get across 800 men onto Canadian territory. They plant 3 Irish flags, and they start to claim parts of Ontario as territory for the new Irish Republic. And it's not for more than 24 hours before the Irish actually encounter any Canadian Defense Forces. This map here will show you sort of the movement of the troops. The movement of the Fenians are on these blue lines here. The movement of the Canadian Defense Forces are in red. And they will meet up on the morning of June 2nd, 1866, in a town called Ridgeway, about 20 miles south of Niagara Falls. And John O'Neill will see the Canadian Defense Forces coming and can see that he's outnumbered about 3 to 1. However, he has a much more experienced force. Many of his men were veterans of the Civil War, whereas a lot of the Canadian militiamen, they're farmers who had never fired guns in their lives. It includes a regiment of students from the University of Toronto who were studying for their final exams, and then they got a knock on their door the night before the invasion. Said, good news, you don't have to study for your finals anymore. Bad news is you need to be at the drill shed in downtown Toronto at 5 a.m. tomorrow, where you're going to be given a gun and sent to the southern border to prevent the invaders from coming in. So it's outside the village of Ridgeway that a battle ensues between these two forces. And with their superior numbers, the Canadians get the better part of the battle. And O'Neill shows himself to be a good commander, even though he doesn't have much experience. He knows he has a very experienced group, and he has them fall back fall back to a high point. And the Canadians basically outrun their lines. And at the last moment, O'Neill comes charging over the top on top of a horse and gives an order for his men to charge. And the inexperienced Canadians see John O'Neill on a horse and think a cavalry attack is coming, but it's just one man on a horse. So the Canadians go into a standard formation against a cavalry attack that leaves them wide open to the onslaught that comes from the infantry that starts pushing forward and very rapidly overwhelms the Canadians and ends up winning the Battle of Ridgeway in what becomes a victory for these Irish forces. And I'll show you this. This is the most popular depiction of the Battle of Ridgeway, but it's completely ahistorical. For one thing, the Irish were not in all green uniforms. They were, as I said, wearing their Union blues and Confederate grays. They were not fighting these close quarters like you would see at the reenactments of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. They're not fighting in these open fields. They're fighting in an apple orchard. They have to go over split rail fences. It's a very confusing battle scene. And the irony is that the men who are wearing the green uniforms that day are the Canadian Defense Forces. They're the ones who are clad in green. And this is a watercolor that was done by an eyewitness at the scene. Shows you really what the true Battle of Ridgeway looked like that day. So with his victory, O'Neill starts to wonder, where are all the reinforcements coming? Where are all the Canadians who are supposed to be rising up to help me? So he circles back to their landing point in Fort Erie, where there's another gun battle that the Fenians end up winning. And he discovers that basically the American warships have gone out to the Niagara River, they've cut the supply lines, and John O'Neill knows that without any possibility of reinforcements, there's really no point in going on with the invasion. So O'Neill orders a retreat back across the Niagara River. And as they retreat back across the Niagara River, the American warship will arrest all the hundreds of Fenians, keep them out on this barge you see towed to the back of the USS Michigan, keep them out on a barge for a good 48 hours before President Johnson decides that he's going to crack down on the Fenians. He will allow the release of all the Fenian rank and file, but John O'Neill and his fellow officers will stand trial in Buffalo. They are released on bail with the help of a local Buffalo lawyer by the name of Grover Cleveland, who of course will go on to be president of the United States. With that, I've taken you all of about 100 pages into the 300 plus pages of when the Irish invaded Canada. But I will tell you, before John O'Neill leaves Canadian territory, he lines up the prisoners that the Fenians have taken. These Canadians figure that they're about to face the firing squad, but John O'Neill actually goes down one by one, shakes each man's hand, and then vows in his best Douglas MacArthur impersonation that he will return, and next time with a much bigger force. And John O'Neill will be a man of his word. He's going to lead invasions again in 1870, 1871. By the end of the book, you won't know if John O'Neill is a hero or sort of a tragic hero of Shakespeare, or just a star in a comic opera. It really starts to get really farcical at the end. But I will give you this spoiler. The idea of invading Canada and holding it hostage and ransoming it for Ireland's independence didn't work. So what's the legacy? Well, there's three things. One is the Fenians actually bring freedom to one part of the British Empire, just not the one they expected. It's Canada that becomes its own sovereign nation in the months following the Fenian raids, because the Canadians were not too happy with the job the British had done defending their territory. And the Fenian raids are one of the real stimulating points that lead to what's called the Confederation of Canada, an idea that had been bubbling at the time, but the Fenian raids really set this in motion. So in July 1st, 1867, the first federal parliament is seated in Ottawa, and Ottawa is chosen as the capital. It's a backwater lumber town, but the reason it's chosen is because it needs to be far enough away from the American border, because these invasions from America were happening every generation or so, and the Canadians didn't want to have it in Montreal or Toronto, where it was too close to the border. Second thing the Fenians do is they establish this transatlantic network, Republican network, with money and arms being raised in America and the manpower being put together in Ireland that is successful in the 19-teens, 1920s, eventually with the Irish War of Independence. So the Irish Brotherhood that James Stephens forms in 1858 is still the organization in 1916 that will launch the Easter Rising. So the third thing, though, I think it's really the Fenians. They carry the torch of revolution from the Young Ireland generation in 1848 and pass it along to the Easter Rising generation in 1916. And they know that the odds are overwhelmingly against them. And we tend to watch Hollywood stories where people who face overwhelming odds, they have success, but that's not the way that much of life evolves. But that doesn't mean that because you face overwhelming odds and likely don't have the prospects of seeing success in your lifetime, that you don't take up the fight. So whether it's a fight for civil rights, a fight against cancer, you may not see the fruits of those labors in your lifetime, but maybe future generations down the line will. So I think that's really one of the lasting legacies the Fenian Brotherhood and the story of when the Irish invaded Canada. So I guess out with that, if there's any questions that anyone has, be happy to take them.
Anybody does have any questions, feel free to either
I've got one.
yourself and just ask or type into the chat box.
Yeah. So great presentation. I knew nothing at all about any of this. I'm quite fascinated. I guess my question is just that since you mentioned that this presentation basically went 100 pages into your book, I'm trying to imagine what the last 200 plus pages are covering. Just in a simple version.
Yeah. So you have, in the aftermath of this one attack on led by John O'Neill, you have dozens of American citizens, Irish Americans, who were put on death row and were going to be executed in Canada. And this becomes a big diplomatic row between Canada, the United States, and Great Britain, and leads to a lot of international law that's still with us today. But in the days after this attack on the Niagara Peninsula, there's another invasion that goes through northern Vermont from a town called Franklin into southern Quebec. So that invasion happens in the aftermath of this one in 1866. In 1870, when John O'Neill launches another attack, incredibly, he launches it down the same exact road in Franklin, Vermont, that the previous invasion was in 1866. And one of my favorite characters in the book is a man named Alva Richard, who's this dairy farmer who lives on the US-Canadian border. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, because twice in 4 years, his farm turns into a battlefield between Canadians and Americans from some geopolitical, conflict that's happening thousands of miles away. He's sort of, if you ever heard that guy Wilmer McLean in the Civil War, who his house got shut up at the Battle of Bull Run, so he fled for safer pastures in Appomattox Courthouse, and it was then in his parlor where the Civil War ended. Alva Richard sort of strikes me as the Wilmer McLean of this story. So there's that attack in 1870, and then in 1871, John O'Neill is going to lead another attack from North Dakota into Manitoba. So also entwined in this is there's still that group of Fenians who hold on to the idea of having the revolution in Ireland, and they will try that in 1867 as well. So that's part of the book too, is talking about the Fenian rising in Ireland in 1867 that's occurring. So there's just a lot of events unfolding in different places in the 5 years that follow this, the Fenian raids. And then what really brings it to end, it really takes the energy out of the movement, is that ultimately the United States in 1871 settles the Alabama claims with Great Britain. So no longer does the United States really care and use the Fenians as pawns in their way of getting the British to pay up their money. So that and the failures on the battlefield really takes the steam out of the movement in 1871.
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, just saying thank you. Yeah.
Somebody just wrote in a question. I'm going to mangle this because I don't have my reading glasses on, but oh, I just lost it. Where'd it go? Oh, here it is. Okay. Did the Fenians fight in?
Want me to read it for you?
Oh, please. Is that you?
No, it's not my question, but I'll read it. This is from
please.
Denise. This helps put my Canadians of English origin into context. They fought with 21st Battalion, Richelieu Light Infantry for Canada. Did the Fenians fight in La Colle in June 1866?
I'd have to really get back and research that to know the exact answer. The name, the Richelieu Light Infantry certainly sounds familiar to me. La Colle, however, I'm not that familiar with. So what happens in June 1866 in that invasion in southern Quebec, in the wake of the attack on Ontario, the Canadian Defense Forces actually move about 15 miles back and leave southern Quebec wide open for the Fenians to cross the border. And they do so, they make camp a few hundred yards over the border. They then start to plunder some of the farms in the nearby towns. But there's no actual gun battle going on until the Fenians hear that the Canadians are coming. They drop back, and as they're doing their final retreat, there's gunfire right at the border between Franklin, Vermont, and what is known, I think it's Frelicksburg is the town on the Quebec side today. So that's the only engagement that happens in June of 1866. So that's the geographic.
Like right over the border from Alberg?
Okay, so that's maybe a little further west of Frelicksburg, if I've got that correct. So yeah, so I think
for most of June, so they must have been at least a backup line.
Yep. So what happened there were these periodic, there was activity going on in the weeks after that too, and there were reports of some periodic incursions that were happening of Fenians just crossing the line. And near Augsburg, that was one place where that was occurring. So there are reports that did occur in that area of Quebec. Yeah.
And then, of course, these people just went over the border and lived in Vermont right after that.
Well, that's the funny thing about the border at that time is that, people didn't have the sense of necessarily being American or Canadian, and they would regularly live on different sides of the border, travel across it all the time. Even that man, Albert Richard, who I talked about, had many relatives who were defending Canada from the invaders, so the people who lived on both sides of the border were not happy that the Fenians were there. I mean, they just saw as that was their area of the world that they were living in, as much as, the towns that we live in today. People were freely moving across it. There wasn't this stark contrast between the border that really occurs.
Do you think that this conflict wasn't a catalyst to push people to the States? Or because I was kind of wondering about if it was something that's like, we're not fighting this anymore, we're just going to go to Vermont.
No, I don't think so. Because strangely enough, you have people who did flee to safety in June 1866 who were crossing into the United States just to be on the other side of it. But really, the demographics of southern Quebec at the time were quite different than what they are today. So today, when you cross the border, you're immediately, you know that you're in a French-speaking area predominantly. At the time, in 1866, a lot of the people who lived there in the eastern townships were descendants of loyalists, and they were basically given land by the Canadian government who wanted to populate this area of southern Quebec. It was pretty unpopulated until they started giving land to these descendants of loyalists, sort of like the homesteaders in American history. So most of the people who were on that side were, had American lineage, they're English speakers, quite different than what it is today.
I think somebody had a comment for you, Dave.
Yeah, could I have a comment? Good to meet you, Christopher. It's a fascinating book. I just want to tell you that this is a great presentation, I'm glad you didn't go into the last 200 pages because I want to read those on my own. But I was told about this book just before the pandemic, and my local library sent me to a different library, not too far from here, and I picked it up there just before they had it cataloged on the shelf. So I was the first one to get my hands on that one at any rate. And now I'm on a genealogy conference call, well, a Zoom meeting, I guess you'd call it, every Monday. And I was so excited about the Fenians, I started talking about it. We have people from all over the world on those meetings, and there was a couple of people from Canada. They said, Fenians, we learned all about them in high school. And I thought, I'm 60-something years old. I never heard of the Fenians.
Yeah.
But it's just a cultural thing where, of course, obviously, it's a vastly more important to people from Canada than it would be for us down here in the States. I was just intrigued by the whole concept of the Irish trying to capture Quebec. But thanks for the presentation. Thanks for writing the book.
No
I'll
problem.
get a few
Yeah, I
more
mean,
of
it's
those.
something I didn't know anything about this either until I was writing my previous book. And as I mentioned, it was the biography of John L. Sullivan. There's a talk of one of his ring opponents was a veteran of the war against Canada. And I did a double take. I'm like, what the heck is this all about? And then as I dug into it, I saw, what an incredible story. But it's one that gets lost to us in the United States because it's just surrounded by the Civil War and Reconstruction. And, those are just two monumental events in American history. So this is one that sort of gets pushed.
Sure, the North won the Civil War, so we were the heroes, and who cares about anything else? We're terrific.
Yep.
Next. Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually, that does bring a question for me, because I had never heard of this period of history either until your book came out. So I'm curious, in Canada, is this period of history much more, would the average Canadian know about this period of their history, or are they kind of like a lot of Americans and maybe never really heard about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think older Canadians certainly know a little bit more of it than the younger generations. But as Dave mentioned, I mean, it's something that is, I've heard, some schools teach it, some schools haven't. But it is, because it is this moment that leads up to the Confederation and sort of the birth of the country, it's something that gets, can get covered in history books. And so prior to writing my book, there have been a handful of books about the Fenian raids, but they've all been from the Canadian perspective. So mine really was the first to try to tell this story from the perspective of the Irish Americans who were carrying out the attack. But if you go up there, you'll see some mention in some of the museums, and there's a few historical markers. So it's not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily be this seminal moment in Canadian history that everyone knows about, but certainly, of course, it has a lot broader knowledge up there than it does on this side of the border.
Are there any more questions? Well, I want to thank you, Christopher, for a great presentation and a book that I desperately need to read now that I've attended this talk. If anybody would like to see this event, it's been recorded, or if you have friends that maybe you couldn't make it, it'll be made available tomorrow on the library's YouTube channel. I'll send out a post to Facebook once it's ready. But thank you, everybody, for coming out. Thank you for being here, and have a good night, everyone.
Leave in the lower right-hand corner.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.